Good to see you.
Long time.
Yeah,
How are you doing?
how's it?
How are you?
Thank you.
Got so quiet.
Well, good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm Tellis. I'm a senior fellow at the endowment, and I'm delighted to host this conversation that we have somewhat provocatively titled India in Modi's Third Term. I think the discussion could not be timelier because in a couple of days, India will begin the 18th exercise of this demonstrating universal franchise. And by all accounts, it's likely to set new records, even by India's long and established history of setting records where elections go. The elections promise to see the largest number of votes ever cast. And it could also see Prime Minister Modi return to power for a historic third term. Historic because he will be the first Prime Minister not belonging to the Congress Party to enjoy such a distinction. Of course, I do not want to presume that the outcome of this election is foreordained. We will all wait to see what the judgment of the Indian people brings. But by most reliable polling, it appears that our mildly provocative title might not be so provocative after all, because the betting is that Prime Minister Modi will return to office with most of the uncertainty revolving around the number of seats that he will get in this 18th Lok Sabha. In any case, I'm very privileged that we have two distinguished guests who, in the interests of truth in advertising, I must tell you are also good friends of mine. Ashok Malik and Alyssa Ayres. And I'm delighted that both of them have joined us this afternoon to reflect upon the issue of India and Modi's third term. Let me start with Alyssa, who's nearest to me here. She's the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs and Professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University here in Washington. And prior to her current academic life, Alyssa also worked in a think tank at the Council on Foreign Relations in the private sector, and for a brief while was actually my colleague in the US government. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia in the Obama administration. And I really had the privilege of working with Alyssa for a little while there on the civil nuclear deal when we were negotiating the long and complicated evolution. Also delighted to welcome Ashok Malik, who is visiting us from India. Ashok is a partner at the Asia Group and the chair of its India subsidiary in New Delhi. So he is currently in the private sector. But prior to this evolution, Ashok had a storied career in journalism, and he too ended up in a think tank. He was the distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. And after this entire sequence, he served in government. He served in the government of India first as the press secretary to the President of India, and later as a policy advisor in the Ministry of External Affairs. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you were the highest non-career appointee in the ministry during your tenure.
The ministry still hasn't forgotten that.
Well, it's a cross you will carry for the rest of your life. But welcome, Ashok, and welcome, Alyssa. It's wonderful to have you both. So I want to keep this session this afternoon primarily as a conversation. But I do want to start, and I'll start with you, Alyssa, by spending if you could spend 2 or 3 minutes just offering some reflections on where you see India today at the end of Modi's second term. And I'll come to you, Ashok, after that, and then we'll take it from there.
So his second term means after a decade in office. And I think, let me speak to the kind of foreign policy India on the world stage, since that's been the subject of some of my more recent work. I think you look at India today after 10 years over the course of the past decade, and you see a country that is beginning to really fulfill its ambitions to be playing a noted role on the world stage as a global power. That has been a longstanding ambition of successive Indian governments, so this is not a new ambition, but I think it is now the case that you do see more countries around the world having India as part of their first or second circle of partners that they want to be closely consulting with or partnering with. And that's been the result of factors that were not unique to Mr. Modi, but have converged during his time in office. India's economic growth. A year and a half ago, India became the world's 5th largest economy. In market exchange rates, right? Not purchasing power parity terms. This is really a big deal. It means that India is now larger as an economy than the economy of the United Kingdom. That is a big deal. And that puts it in kind of a different category. India has not been a member of the G7 group of countries, but has increasingly been invited to join G7 summits as an invited guest. India is a member of the G20 since its inception, because it is one of the world's largest economies, even before it became the 5th largest. The past year, you saw the Indian government take the G20 presidency, which means that India hosted all of the G20 meetings throughout the course of 2023, and really make that kind of an international calling card. It was also a domestic calling card showcasing the way that India's Prime Minister had brought visibility for India on the world stage. Maybe Ashok will speak to some of the domestic impacts of this issue. But I think you do see India becoming much more of like country on speed dial, certainly for the United States. 20 years ago, it was probably more challenging to enter a foreign policy discussion and have India be among the top 5 countries that might come up. And I think that's not as much of a challenge anymore. You see the reemergence of the Quad, not simply as a one-time, one-off consultation on humanitarian assistance, which it was after the Asian tsunami, but the Revive formulation of the Quad, which began in the Trump administration and the Biden administration, has really expanded that. It's become a functioning minilateral organization. It is a small consultation, but it has big ambitions, and India is playing a very significant role in that. It is the only non-US ally that's part of this formulation, and that's ended up being okay. It seems not to have created kind of big challenges for that coordination, and the Quad is seeking to create both a security, public health, supply chain, economic set of consultations for the betterment of the broader Indo-Pacific. I wouldn't have imagined this in that way 15 years ago, for example. So I think this is a pretty positive set of outcomes. Now, I will say a couple things on the domestic side, and Ashok may have a different view. We may have different views here. There is some concern among different parts of the United States and U.S. civil society on some of the direction of India's politics, the role for minorities in India's democracy. Nobody's arguing that India doesn't hold free and fair elections. Of course it does. It's an intensely large democracy. But I think there are some worries and fears that the kind of open, more ecumenical kind of India is changing. And so you do hear from different parts of the US government, from different organizations in the United States that follow these issues closely, that they're wondering about the direction India is headed. And so that, I think, will percolate out in future conversations. Let's see. Ashok may have a different view.
Well, thank you for raising that whole palette of issues before I came to this event this afternoon. I actually went back and skimmed your book from many years ago, Time Has Come. And in some sense, you were almost prophetic because you caught the wave at the earliest phase of India's emergence as a great power. Ashok, how do you see it from inside India? Now, we see India sort of bursting on the world stage in the last few years, very much revolving around the activity of the Prime Minister and his own sort of persona. But how do you see it from within India?
So the past 5 years especially, this is a 10-year period we're discussing, but they're actually two separate 5-year periods, which were both very different. The past 5 years have been a very gritty period for India. They've been very eventful, they've been packed with achievements, but they've also been packed with challenges, and they have been gritty, like for India, as for the rest of the world, but perhaps more so for India. COVID and the pandemic, the Chinese challenge at our borders, 100,000 troops, unprecedented in our history. Then the whole sort of meltdown of the global economic compact. We saw that with President Trump and then President Biden actually continuing that sense of contestation with China. And the Ukraine war, and of course the Middle East burst back to the world stage in an ugly way a few months ago. Now, this has been a gritty and challenging period, but also a very clarifying period. It has got many Indians who still thought there was room on that fence off the fence. We moved off the fence. We know where we are. We know who our friends are. We know where our interests lie. And essentially, we've taken a deep breath with the China relationship. And I don't think there's any going back now. China is an overwhelming factor when India looks at its security, its economic agenda, its global strategy, its global South strategy, its Indian Ocean strategy. China is just overwhelming. And this obviously means that countries that share our concerns about China are just countries we become much closer to. So in that sense, the US relationship today is different, not just from what it was 15 years ago, but from what it was 5 years ago. Now, the past 10 years have also been a period of great achievement in terms of infrastructure, digitization, formalization of the economy. To use one metric, we had 74 airports when Mr. Modi took office. Today we have 149. But much of the previous 74 have been upgraded as well. And I can cite similar figures for roads, highways, ports, whatever you want. There've also been strong foreign policy linkages with key countries, the US, the UAE, the Gulf countries, the EU, the FTA negotiations, which will conclude someday when we all have grandchildren, have begun again. But in a sense, India's transformation is contingent upon its a more energetic foreign policy and a domestic transformation, but much more than that, an economic transformation, which will really add to its composite national power. The ground for that has been laid, whether in terms of infrastructure or international partnerships. But the next 5 years will determine exactly what we can achieve. And that's what makes this 5-year period very crucial. And this is not just me saying it because there's an election ahead of us. If you look at the economic strategy of the government as spelled out by the Prime Minister, this would be validated. India's economy today is about $4 trillion, give or take a bit. About 15% of that is manufacturing. The government says it wants to move the economy to a roughly $10 trillion size by the second half of the 2030s, 25% of which is manufacturing, which is a very stiff metric, very, very stiff. But that's about a little over a decade away. So if we have to reach anywhere close to that number, the next 5 years have to be transformational, especially with the global opportunities in supply chains. So we are at the cusp of a make or break 5-year period. Now, coming to the issue you raised about domestic tensions and domestic issues. Look, they're not altogether absent, I'm not denying that. But frankly, in a time of global stress, of domestic stress, of economic restlessness, of social and economic dislocation, many democracies are facing such challenges. And social media adds to that because it amplifies everything. Such challenges exist in the US, they exist in the UK, they exist in France, and in India as well. I would still say that while ugly things are sometimes said and ugly things sometimes happen, the differential between how much is said and how much is done is still fairly manageable. The say-do ratio, as it were, is still fairly manageable. And I think, or I do believe the senior leadership of the country and the government is cognizant that it must remain manageable. Also, I work with companies now. I work with investors trying to come into India or sometimes Indian companies trying to go abroad. When big business from India, from Korea, from Japan contemplates the investment landscape across the world, it does see social tensions in many countries. It sees social tensions in India as well. It asks questions about that. But compared to many other countries, the social tensions in India seem relatively benign. While not altogether absent, they seem relatively benign. So we need to consider that as well.
So let me ask you, because I think when we look for the next 5 years, and we look at the next 5 years with the prism of the last 5, there is the sense that Prime Minister Modi pursued 2 sets of policies concurrently. One was putting in place the foundations for long-term economic growth, all the things that you described in terms of economic investments and so on and so forth. But he also pursued what one senior Indian official once said, a strategy of consolidating his Hindu base. And he did that because it goes back to sort of the antecedents of the BJP. And he checked off all the boxes in the last 5 years with respect to Article 370 and so on and so forth. The next 5 years, he's got this vision now of Viksit Bharat. And he wants India to become essentially a developed country by 2047, right? How is he going to balance these 2 sort of strands? The strand of consolidating power for the BJP, which clearly seems to be obviously aim, and understandably all political parties want to be in power permanently, while at the same time putting in place the building blocks for growth. I mean, is there a sense within India that there might be trade-offs between these 2 goals, or can both be pursued concurrently without relatively high costs?
Astute politicians straddle multiple boats, not just in India, but in many countries. So I can answer that question about the domestic agenda, which you referred to, Kashmir, for instance, in multiple ways. One, with 2 successive majority governments, 2 successive victories, issues that mattered to the core of the BJP needed to be addressed. You couldn't keep ignoring them and saying, look, you've given us 2 good mandates, now we're still doing something else. Okay? It would have been dishonest. Kashmir was crying out for some sort of a response. It has been for years, you know that better than I do. 40,000 people killed in over 20 years. Is Kashmir better off than it was 5 or 7 years ago? I would say it is better off. Is it where I'd like it to be? No, not at all. But some steps needed to be taken, and that response was popular. It had appeal across India. Because in a sense, Kashmir became the final fault line that the Indian state was battling. Relatively speaking, the fault lines in Mizoram, in even Nagaland, have been pacified one way or the other, sometimes with compromise, sometimes with military action, whatever it is. Even the Maoist challenge, though that there has been an incident only recently, is not what it was even 20 years ago. So Kashmir, in a sense, became the fault line on which the entire country's eyes were focused. I'll give you one example. When we had the Balakot incident in 2019, and an Indian pilot was captured by Pakistan, his release became the highest watched event across news, social, soap operas, everything in Kerala. And 20 years ago, both of you know India, 20 years ago, Kerala wouldn't have bothered about Kashmir. But it became overwhelming, it needed to be addressed. And then, of course, there was the Ayodhya issue, which I'm glad it's reached a solution it has. I'm glad it's behind us. And there is a lot of people are happy with the temple being built. There are also people with another view. I appreciate that. But this was something festering for years, for decades. It needed to come to a solution. And it has. It's not a perfect solution. Not everyone's happy, but it's a solution that is broadly accepted. Now, I don't think there is a desire to keep pushing and looking for other such issues and themes down the line, because the economic agenda, the economic transformation of India is extremely important, not just for the government, but for middle-class India. I mean, you have a country today which has more internal migration than ever before in its history because of the macroeconomic churning. And people are conscious of that. People do recognize that identity matters, and of course it does. And as you become more prosperous, it matters even more. But the economy and the idea that India can matter much more on the world stage is an overwhelming sentiment.
Let me come back to the question of the economy, because that, to my mind, in many ways is the central driver for what happens. And Alyssa, let me ask you, we heard yesterday at the conference that you hosted at GW, which, by the way, was absolutely fabulous. And if you did not attend it personally, you should wait for the videotape of the conference to be uploaded, and you should watch it beginning to end.
Thank you.
Really excellent. I mean, it's a tutorial within a few hours of everything you wanted to know about the Indian economy. One of the things that struck me in the discussion yesterday was that if India is to realize its ambitions, it needs to sustain 10% annual growth rates, at least for the remainder of this decade and possibly the next. Now, when I think of those numbers, they're quite staggering numbers, because India has been growing at atypically high growth rates now for about 30 years. If India can pull off 10% for another 20 years, it will be a 50-year run of high growth rates. So, one, is this realistic? And two, what must India do to get there, which is the more important question in my book. When you think about India, its engagement with the world economically, what does India need to do to make the 10% growth rate viable?
I think you see unfolding in India actually a set of debates about what India should do to reach those high rates of growth. Is this realistic? Hard to say. There's only been a few years in which India had double-digit growth. They've been at 6, 7, 8% more recently. Of course, COVID was a major shock, as it was around the world. India is now bouncing back from that, finally. But 10% is a lot, and 10% to sustain over another decade, that's going to be challenging. You see unfolding in the policy, the economic policy world, really a kind of big debate over whether India should continue its focus on trying to achieve manufacturing-led growth because of the job creation it could provide, the kind of growth that transformed the East Asian and Southeast Asian economies, or whether the space for that kind of growth is already too late on the world stage, and whether India should continue with focusing on some manufacturing, but also emphasizing opportunities in services. It's been a services leader. Services has not been able to produce jobs at scale. India has this huge youth population, needs to continually be job creating, again, for decades ahead, through 2047. It's actually really important to do that. And I think the jury is out on this. I think there's nobody who has a clear answer on exactly how a double-digit growth rate can be attained again and maintained over another decade. So you're going to see different approaches here. Prime Minister Modi has a policy focused on manufacturing. which is the same policy that the Congress-led coalition government had prior to Mr. Modi's government coming in, which just goes to show how important this is as a policy focus, right? Successive Indian governments across different parties have tried to increase the percentage of manufacturing in the Indian economy. And despite attention to this issue, actually that needle hasn't moved. It's dipped a little bit. It went from, what, 17% to 15, something like that?
Something of that sort.
Yeah. And so that's an important question, right? Yeah. How can India increase that percentage of manufacturing in GDP? How can it do so over a long period? Does it need to do so anymore? Are there other ways that India can create jobs for this huge demographic, help the economy continue high rates of growth for that transformation that the country, not just the BJP-led country, but the successive Indian governments have been talking about for years? So after saying all that, I don't have a magic prescription here. And I think we're going to continue to see this as a big debate in Indian society, particularly among policymakers focused on the economy.
Let me jump off that set of remarks because I agree with you completely. I edited a book about 5 years ago.
I remember.
Looking about India and the quest for greatness. And one of the things we found in the work that Rakesh Mohan did actually for that book was that you can't get to these stratospheric growth rates without manufacturing. So it raises two questions that I want to pose to you, Ashok. Is capital-intensive, high-technology manufacturing, which is what the Prime Minister seems to be pushing very hard with Apple and semiconductors and Tesla and so on and so forth, is that the solution when India is still a labor surplus economy? So that's question number one. And two, are there other things that have to be done in the reform circuit to sort of shake the factors of production loose in order to be able to sustain this emphasis on manufacturing over the next decade? So leave the services versus manufacturing question aside because I don't think it's a particularly productive question.
You need both. You need both.
And exactly.
And for the prosperity of the Indian people, whether they have a job or don't have a job, you need growth. So that's taken for granted. Let me put it this way. Any country and any government, Mr. Modi's government, India, any entity is going to look at opportunities where they exist, not where they should exist. So if the opportunities right now, as global supply chains are reordered, are in semiconductors, in electronics manufacturing, in electric vehicles, and in green manufacturing, some of which happen to be capital intensive, Mr. Modi is not going to sit back and say, no, I have surplus labor, I'm not going to do this. It doesn't make sense. And frankly, if electric vehicles come into India, as Musk is visiting India next week, or this weekend, sorry, it's much of the capital is going to come from him rather than from the Indian taxpayer. So, and it will produce jobs down the line. Not hundreds of thousands, but still a significant number. There is a larger question, which is that is manufacturing, labor-intensive manufacturing leading to exports, which is the model the East Asian tigers followed and China followed. Can that model be entirely replicated in India? Frankly, I don't think it does. It can, because I don't think there's any new China. There's no next China. We have seen a meltdown of that model, and we've seen a dispersal of that model across geographies, including here, the reindustrialization of America, which China did not have to cope with. India has to cope with that. India has to cope with that as a trade partner, as a competitor for investment, including American investment. China didn't. I had a major semiconductor manufacturer coming to India last year to look at an investment. Three visits, intense visits. And they were looking at India, Vietnam, and Japan. And he told me, he said, Vietnam, the reddest of the red carpets, but 99 million people, very few engineers. Japan, the ecosystem is all there, but it's bloody expensive. India, a large number of engineers. Some of them need to be reskilled. We'll do it, but the talent pool is there. The geographical expanse is there, but no ecosystem yet. So there's no perfect answer. There's no, it's not that you can come to India and get all that you need, or you go to Vietnam and get all you need. We'd all get a little bit of the slice. And whatever you can grab in the next 5 years, whatever opportunity you can grab in this, as manufacturing is reordered for a generation, India will have to grab. And at the end of 5 years or 7 years, sit back and say, okay, this is what we managed to get. Now what do we need to do in addition to this?
I understand the political logic that drives that completely. What I'm still struggling to get a fix on is how does India employ these large numbers of people who are coming into the workforce in a way that allows it to exploit the demographic dividend that we've been talking about for decades, right? And if you assume that the demographic dividend is going to last at best for another 10 years, because Indian population growth will slow. It already is in the South. I mean, fertility rates are the same as the rest in the advanced world. How does one deal with this? I mean, Alyssa, do you have any sense of what the Indian discussion is about addressing this part of the labor force, which is young, not always perfectly skilled, but certainly willing to work, very aspirational? Yeah. How does India work its magic to get them on board?
I do think some of that conversation is about entry-level manufacturing. India is one of the world's largest textile producers. The Indian government has created a production-linked incentive in technical textiles. So again, a kind of higher-level product. As I mentioned earlier, I took advantage of the fact that we were going to talk today to really look closely at the BJP's new manifesto, platform for the elections. And there is a whole section in there that focuses on manufacturing in specific sectors, railways, airplanes, defense. I mean, they have laid out a plan of trying to become a world hub for these kinds of big industrial products. But I think it's also that's going to take some time, right? It's also the case that they'll need to be looking at front-facing services, retail, the growth of retail, small and medium enterprises, job creation in small spaces that can grow and become larger enterprises. But the government has had, and successive governments have had, a focus on micro, small, medium-scale enterprises for some time. So can it do what needs to be done to create globally competitive enterprises that can be part of these global supply chains? I think that's kind of the question mark out there.
But the ambition to become part of that global supply chain has become very clear, right?
Very
and
clear.
The Prime Minister has said this on so many occasions. Yeah. Ashok, how do you reconcile this ambition with what is a complaint in the United States that has really intensified in the last few years about India's foreign trade policies? I mean, in some ways, there seems to be a sort of schizophrenia where India today has rediscovered the virtues of FTAs. And India seems to be negotiating ambitious FTAs with a slew of countries, in contrast to the diffidence that the Prime Minister had about FTAs in his first term. But at the same time, the objective of becoming part of a global supply chain is counteracted by the rise in tariffs, increasing protectionism, and India is not unique. I mean, we are now slowly becoming world leaders in that same path. But for India, the costs are high, right? Because we already have connectivity with the world. India is trying to build that connectivity. In a third term, will the Prime Minister sort of confront this tension and take it head on?
Okay, so FTAs, there's a bit of a history here. India signed a slew of FTAs in the early 2000s, primarily with countries to its east, ASEAN as a collective and individual countries within ASEAN. There was an idealism to that process. perhaps people felt that domestic industry would miraculously reorganize itself to take advantage of market access. It didn't quite work that way. It ended up providing entry for cheap imports and eventually cheap Chinese imports. And that it invited a political pushback, as it has, frankly, here as well. There was a correction to it when Mr. Modi came to office, because many of those trade agreements came up for renewal then. That correction, that pause, perhaps went a bit too far, and it led to no movement on trade. And then, of course, RCEP was a defining moment when at least 2 Indian ministers told me that whichever way we look at it, RCEP looks to be like an FTA with China, which we don't want to do. Politically, it's impossible, and we'll become part of the Chinese system. And that was the... So the FTAs we've negotiated since then, the past 3 or 4 years, I wouldn't call them ambitious. I'd call them pragmatic, and I wouldn't even call them free trade agreements in the sense we defined them in the early 2000s. They are feasible trade agreements, and every agreement has its own feasibility test. The FTA with EFTA, the 4 EFTA countries, offers tariff concessions contingent upon $10 billion of investment in 10 years or 15 years, which is very unusual. But so today's FTAs are more, we like you, let's do business together, rather than a genuine FTA. And this is, again, true for all countries, not just for India. But the other point you raised about if you want to enter global value chains, how do you rationalize tariffs, especially for ingredients and components? That's been a long-standing debate, or a very intense debate between, frankly, the finance ministry in India and the industry ministry in India. So it's not just between international stakeholders in India, it's at the heart of the government. And there is some hope, and I do believe this is a combination of what I've heard and what I've read and what perhaps wishful thinking as well, that there will be some rationalization very early in the new government's, if this government comes back to office, of course, very early in the new government's term. Because minus that rationalization, India will simply not see the integration with global value chains that it desires.
Right.
And that's recognized.
So let me use that as a launch pad to actually turn to foreign relations, because implicit in this understanding is that India is going to not only become part of a global system, but is also rethinking its foreign relations, as you pointed out in your early remarks. And I want to start with that question. It seems to me today that US-India relations are the best they've been as long as I've been in this business.
Absolutely.
And those have been driven, I think, by 2 variables which have interacted sort of productively. There is an increase in US-China rivalry, which was many years in the coming, but has finally come. And there has been an upsurge in scratchiness in Sino-Indian relations because of all the developments post-2020. So Alyssa, let me ask you, when you look at these 2 sort of relationships which are troubled, is this a sustainable basis for us to maintain a relationship with India? I mean, I understand the Kautilyan principle of enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so on and so forth. But how do you see the long-term incentives for the United States and India to sustain this relationship, even beyond the China factor?
Well, I don't think the China factor is the only basis for an expanded relationship. But I do think that it has provided a backdrop in which, as Ashok said, India has decided that it knows and understands where its partners and supporters will be. And that has given way to an intensified kind of consultation, an intensified level of partnership. Again, it's not an alliance, but there are close partner behaviors and consultations short of an alliance. I think that's likely to continue. I don't see a reversal of that. I am not sure that we'll see an intensification to a treaty alliance. I still don't think that that's on the cards. But I also think that the economic piece is an important parallel component of what's happened in the India-US relationship. There are many problems and challenges, long-standing trade disputes in the relationship. Some of them have been solved, many of them remain. I think there's a lot to give trade negotiators plenty to talk about for years and years.
To earn their keep.
Yeah, and some of these are like mind-numbingly technical kinds of issues. But I do think, the size of the Indian economy, its continued growth, there is a lot of interest in seeing. The Indian government has sought investment in the Indian economy, and that has also been a reason to keep American companies engaged and returning, to try to negotiate what their best opportunity might be for the Indian market or for India as a hub for markets nearby. And I think that's going to continue to be an important piece of what ties the countries together. It's a strong and growing economic relationship. The trade volume in goods and services is nearly 200 billion. 12, 13, 14 years ago, it was hovering around 100 billion. I mean, that's a good story. There's still problems, right? I'm not pretending there aren't, but this is really quite something at a time when there is a politically led push, certainly in the United States, to think about friendshoring, supply chain relocation to places that do not produce the same kind of risk or uncertainty for American companies. So I think that's another piece of it. So I think the China factor has helped bring the countries together, there's no doubt. And should that change, I think there still is an economic logic to the relationship.
So tie the pieces for us together, Ashok. I mean, you worked with all the principals in the current government as they reformulated their relationship